Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for coming to our brown bag presentation today. My name is Erica Goodoff, and I'm a senior scientific editor in scientific publications in the Research Medical Library. And this talk this afternoon is called 10 Things You Don't Want Journals to Say About Your Paper. So, you've written a research paper, and you're going to submit it to a journal in hopes of getting it published in that journal. You probably know, or you'll find out very quickly, that it's not likely to just immediately get accepted and published as is. You're going to get some sort of feedback from the journal editors or from the peer reviewers when you submit your paper. So we all know that. But hopefully the feedback that you get from journals, from the editors, from the peer reviewers, is something that's useful and expresses an understanding of what you were trying to publish. Basically something that makes your science better and makes your paper a much better contribution to the literature. At least that's the goal of peer review. The things I'm going to talk about today are sentiments that suggest that a peer reviewer or possibly a journal editor doesn't really think your paper can be published. And that's why you don't want peer reviewers or journal editors to be thinking these things. Now the good news is these are all things that you can avoid before you submit your paper for the first time to be published. So with that in mind, we're going to get to it. And I should also mention these are all sentiments that we've seen expressed by peer reviewers in comments from reviewers when we've seen revised versions of papers. Maybe not expressed quite this way, but certainly these are sentiments that we've seen before. So they're things worth thinking about before you submit your paper, and hopefully things that you don't ever have to worry about hearing about after you've submitted your paper. So, first thing you don't want a journal editor to be thinking when they see your paper is, why are you here? An editor might be thinking this kind of sentiment when you've submitted a paper to a journal that's not really appropriate for your paper, that the topic that you're researching is maybe outside the scope of that journal, or maybe you've written a paper that's a particular format or type of paper that journal doesn't accept. Now this can be a problem for a couple of reasons. Obviously it can delay publication of your article. If the editor kicks it back to you and says, we don't accept this type of paper, this is out of scope for us, that's that much more time that you have to spend finding a different journal and submitting it and going through all this process again. It can also diminish the impact of your work because you're basically not reaching the right audience. Hopefully your goal is to reach an audience of people who are going to read your research paper and think it's important, and also hopefully cite your research when they go to do their own research from having read it. So if you go to the wrong journal or something that's outside the scope, you have a lot less chance of doing that. And it can kind of give the impression to a journal editor that maybe you're not familiar with this field or you don't really know very much about the topic, and that's definitely not the first impression that you want to make. So, things you can do to make sure that you've picked the right journal. First of all, you might want to honestly assess the impact of your research. Not everything that you research and write about and try to publish in a journal is going to be earth-shattering and paradigm-shifting and change the world. That's okay, we all know that. But it's good to think about this ahead of time when you submit your paper. You probably have a lot better chance of getting it published and getting it to an audience that appreciates and is likely to cite your work if you think about a good audience and good journal for your work ahead of time before you submit. So once you have a thought in mind of who you want to be reading and possibly citing your paper, you might think about asking your colleagues for some recommendations. Okay, well I know who I'm trying to reach with this paper. Hey, let me ask my PI, what do you think, which journal do you think would be a good one for this paper, for this topic? Who do you think is likely to publish this? And once you have some titles in mind, then it's a really good idea to pull up the journal website and just briefly take a look at it. Read their aims and scope and see if that's consistent with what you're trying to publish. See if they publish the type of article that you're writing, if it's not, an original research paper. See if that's something they accept. Usually you can tell from a quick glance at a journal website if that's the case, if you're within their topic, if they take your type of paper, and that sort of thing. So that's a really good way to get off on the right foot when you submit your paper. Make sure you're going to the right place to begin with. Sort of related to that, you really do not want to submit your paper to a journal and have somebody at the other end look at it and just do this. Did you even read the instructions? What is the deal? Did you even look at them? This kind of sentiment will happen if you vastly exceed the word count for the journal. So you've written an original research paper, and let's say the journal says, we accept original research papers of up to 4,000 words, and yours is 6,500 words. That doesn't necessarily mean that your paper's wrong, but that might not be the right journal, And certainly they're likely to kick it back to you and say, this needs to be shorter before we can even consider it. So you don't want to start off that way. Other things that might cause this kind of problem. Maybe it's the wrong format of paper. Maybe you've got your methods section following your introduction section. That's a very common and totally correct way to write a paper, but everything published in this journal has the methods in a separate section after the discussion. So they're going to kick it back and say, well, okay, you didn't follow the instructions. Other things that might seem minor. Maybe the journal asks you for a statement about potential conflicts of interest from your authors. Maybe they want to know each author's specific contribution to the paper. Maybe they need a statement about informed consent. Things like this that seem like details reflect ethical guidelines of the journal, and it's actually good that a journal is asking for that. But again, if you don't see it in the instructions and don't follow it, you're likely to get someone exasperated on the other end. That can be a problem for a couple of reasons. Obviously, once again, it's a delay in getting your paper published and getting it peer-reviewed. The other thing is it just makes a bad impression. It looks like you aren't paying attention to details. So that's really not a great place to start when you're getting your paper peer-reviewed. You don't want someone thinking, well, this person doesn't care about details. I wonder what else they didn't do. That's really not a great place to start off. So the obvious fix here is make sure you look at the author instructions. On most journal websites, it's pretty easy to find them. They'll say something like instructions to authors, instructions to contributors, or just authors. And you can pull up a document or a page that tells you exactly what these type of things and how you can avoid them. Now obviously, journals vary greatly in how detailed and how useful these instructions pages are. Sometimes they're 11 miles long and there's so many details in there it's almost too much, and sometimes they're like a paragraph and don't tell you hardly anything. But it's always worth at least taking a look. You can always at least say, okay, I followed what instructions there were as best I could. If they're really vague and you're looking for more information, there's also some general guidelines that apply no matter what journal you're submitting to. So if you are working on prospective clinical research, and that's what you're trying to publish, and your journal instructions say you must follow consort guidelines, Consort has its own page, and that will tell you a lot of detail about what that is. That's a checklist of things that you should include in that type of paper that basically ensure that it's rigorous and reproducible research. So it's useful to go look that up if you need to, if it's mentioned in the journal, and really even if it's not, frankly. If they say something about, disclosures or authorship, and you're thinking to yourself, what do they mean by that? What are the specific rules? ICMJE is a good resource for that. That's International Committee of Medical Journal Editors. They have a lot of information on their site about what authorship is, things that could potentially look like a conflict of interest that you might want to disclose to the journal, things like that. So you can always look for these general guidelines if the author instructions aren't particularly helpful. So you have the aims and scope, you've looked at the author instructions, that's a great place to start. That will at least get you to peer review. But if you get to peer review and this is the first thing that they think, that can be a pretty big problem as well. You don't want a peer reviewer to look at your paper, start reading and say, what's the point? Usually this happens when there are problems in the introduction or opening paragraphs of the paper. Maybe there's way too much background information. Maybe there's an extensive literature review and they've gotten 3 pages in and still aren't sure what this paper is about. At that point, you might be starting to lose them a little bit. Maybe it's the opposite problem. Maybe you've introduced a topic vaguely and you get to the purpose of the paper and they're thinking, what does this have to do with this topic that they just introduced? Or why is this important? Why is this research even interesting? These are all problems that can show up in the introduction section of your paper. So having an unclear introduction to your paper can, again, obscure the importance of your study. It can make it harder for a reviewer to understand what they're looking at, why they care, and what the rationale is for this paper. It can be confusing, certainly. It can also suggest to an author that maybe you're disorganized or you don't have a good grasp of what this topic is all about. So once again, we're talking about making a bad first impression just in the opening paragraphs of your paper. So to avoid this, it's helpful to make sure that you've thought through your introduction section when you write it. Including appropriate background information means you want just enough background information to make it clear why you did this study, what you're trying to find out, and why that information is important to add to the literature. So if, for example, you are doing a study of treatment combination, a new treatment combination for a particular disease or a particular patient population. You might introduce that topic by describing a little bit about the disease or why that patient population might be underserved. You might talk about the two treatments and why maybe the two treatments on their own aren't all that effective. And maybe there's some rationale for putting them together. You might think to yourself, well, these have different mechanisms of action, so let's see if these have a synergistic effect. That might be an example of a rationale that you would introduce within your introduction section. You want to make sure that you've introduced the topic with appropriate background information. You provide that rationale, and then make sure that you actually state specifically what the purpose of your introduction is, or a purpose of your paper is. So basically you're introducing a research question. If you're going to test a hypothesis, if you're doing a basic science type paper, this would be the place to state it. If you're just going to say, okay, the purpose was to test this drug in this patient population, or we were going to try and find, we're going to look for biomarkers so that we can see which patients respond to a treatment best. Whatever it is, you want to state it at the end of the introduction section, and you'll certainly come back to it later on in the paper. But if you've led your author, or if you've led your reviewer logically through these steps, that's going to be a great place to start your paper. They're at least go into it knowing, okay, this is important research, I'm going to keep reading. So, let's say they get through your introduction section. Now they've hit your methods section and thinking, are you sure you know what you're doing with this paper? This is another thing you don't want a reviewer to think. This can happen if you've got experiments that maybe aren't described all that clearly, or there's a bunch of details missing for your methods section. Maybe you've got a bunch of methods described, but then you don't have any results that correspond to those methods. All of these are things that can confuse reviewers. And kind of more importantly, these are things that will make reviewers question the rigor of the science, and also the reproducibility of the science. If you haven't described in sufficient detail what you've done, it's going to be hard for a reviewer to look at this and say, okay, I see what they did, this could be replicated, you know, and then we know it's at least rigorous science. So if you have a bunch of missing information, that's going to present a problem. And ultimately, it's going to make it harder for reviewers to interpret your findings and understand, again, why they're important. So, you can avoid this by, again, making sure that you have a complete methods section. One strategy you might use is use statements that are set up kind of this way. So, to determine protein expression between these two patient populations we're studying, we subjected these samples to immunoblotting. Even a sentence that's very simple like that can be a way to lead your reviewer through your methods section so that they understand not just what experiments that you did, but also why you did them. It's going to be a lot easier to follow if you use that kind of setup. If you have, I just used the example, for instance, of immunoblotting. If you're describing an experiment that's done constantly and has a really standardized way of being done, and it's been described 100 times, you can cite something that's been previously described in your methods. You can say, we performed this experiment as described previously, here's a reference. That's okay to do, as long as, one, make sure you provide the reference, and also explain anything that you did that maybe differed from how this experiment is done, in how the standard experiment is performed. If you did something a little bit different, and also what specific population that you used, what specific types of samples, what you were comparing, that sort of thing. So you don't have to absolutely describe everything if it's been described before, but do make sure that it's very easily accessible. And if you're describing something that was done previously, that it's something that really is standard, so it's okay to do that without completely not understanding what you were trying to describe. The other thing that's frequently missing from method sections is statistical details. So I guarantee you, if you have a p-value, if you talk about how there's an association between two variables, a reviewer is going to be looking for statistical information in the methods section. If it's not there, they're definitely going to ask you for it. And that certainly is another thing that falls into the category of reducing the potential rigor of your science. So you don't want to leave that information out, even if it's something relatively simple. We compared these values using a t-test. P is less than 0.05 was considered statistically significant. They're at the very baseline going to be looking for that kind of information in your methods section. So, okay. So you've got a complete methods section. You don't want a reviewer to then get to your results and think, what is this? What is this? What are all these numbers? Where did they come from? What are they trying to do here? So a disorganized results section can also, again, reduce the reproducibility of your paper. It suggests to a reviewer that maybe, again, you're not organized, that you don't have a good grasp of what you're trying to present. Things that might also cause this. So disorganized, just collections of numbers. Maybe you don't have very good subheadings, or maybe you don't have any subheadings in the results section. Maybe you've used tables inefficiently. Maybe there's several tables that each have about 4 numbers in them, and a reviewer is looking at that and thinking, okay, there's some data, what do I do with that information? Or it could be the opposite. Maybe you have a long paragraph at the start of the introduction section. Here's a number, here's a number, here's a number, here's a number, but there's no way to compare them or sort of put them together or get a sense of what they're about. So, once again, this can really disorient reviewers, because they're really going to be looking at your results. Your results end up being the meat of your paper. So if they're not laid out in a way that's easily digested and understood, that can, once again, inhibit reviewers' understanding of your findings and why they're important. And ultimately, it's going to be hard for a reviewer to see how you reached the conclusion that you reached in your study. So, I mentioned subheadings. Subheadings are definitely your friend in the results section. It can help you avoid this sort of problem. If you're writing a basic science paper, you've probably seen this in published papers a number of times, but sometimes the results section in a science paper will have fairly detailed subheadings. They can be relatively long. And in a really well-organized basic science paper, you can read just the subheadings in the results section and get a really good sense of what was going on with this study just from looking at that without even looking at the details. They tend to follow from each other when you do them that way. So an example of that might be gene expression was lower in group A mice than in group B mice, or whatever groups you're comparing, whatever it is you're studying. It can be even a complete sentence like that. So that'll really help your reviewer stay on track and understand the results as you're presenting them. Now in a clinical paper, you're probably not going to have those lengthy type of subheadings, but what is often very helpful is to have subheadings in the results section that are parallel and consistent with what you have in the methods section. So just as an example, a clinical paper almost always starts with some sort of description of the patient population. We recruited patients from this institution who had the following criteria. Or maybe it's retrospective and we looked through a database and we found patients with these criteria. Whatever it is, you probably start your methods by doing that. As soon as you go to the results section, very often the first section is, okay, we recruited this many patients, or we have this many patients in our data set. Half of them were female, the average age was this, and so forth and so on. So you almost always start with those things. And all you need to do from there is follow the same order of presentation in the two sections. And that's going to make it really easy, again, for a reviewer to follow what you're trying to present. It can also help to do that, to help you cross-check the sections and make sure things are consistent between the two. These are all things that'll ensure that you've presented everything that you want to say and in the right order. You can also directly refer to specific methods. So the example that I gave earlier talked about, to determine something, we did this experiment. In the results, the flip side of that might be Kaplan-Meier analysis showed that group A had shorter median progression-free survival than group B. So you've referred back to the methods in the methods section within your results section. And that way you can ensure that you've got good organization between the two sections. And you don't have reviewers just getting confused looking at these sections. So that ends up being the meat of your paper. There's one more section left, and it's usually the difficult one. You don't want a reviewer to get toward the end of your paper and think, okay, this discussion is going nowhere. What is going on here? Very often, a reviewer will get confused or maybe disoriented in the discussion section if it just simply repeats the results again, without providing any further context or meaning to those results. Okay, we saw all these numbers in the last section, and now here they are again. Okay, what do we do with that information? So maybe there's no context for those findings, or maybe there's no implication, there's no real takeaway message. So you've repeated these numbers again and said, hey, we found this, so what do we do with that information? What does that mean going forward? How does that change our understanding of this topic, or how does that potentially change medical practice or clinical practice maybe? Another thing that can happen in the discussion section to cause problems is when There's a bunch of information, a bunch of literature cited, and it's not really clear what that information has to do with your specific findings in the study. So there's a lot of background information. So these authors found this. This other study showed this. And what does that have to do with your findings? So you don't want a discussion to just look like this pile of arrows going every which way. Once again, can inhibit reviewers' understanding. It's hard for them to appreciate your findings if there's not a clear presentation of what your findings mean. And then once again has the problem of it looks like you don't have this thought through, you don't have the expertise that you do have. You don't want to leave this impression in a reviewer's mind. So a good way to help prevent these problems in your discussion section is to start with the conclusions of your paper. So I mentioned earlier in the introduction section of your paper, you introduce a research question, you introduce a hypothesis that you're going to test, you introduce what your goal is in this particular study. When you get to the discussion section, basically the first thing you do is answer that question. Oh, it turned out our results show that our hypothesis was true. That is actually what we found. Or we wanted to test this treatment in this patient group, and our results showed that it worked, it was effective, or maybe that it had a bunch of side effects, or whatever question was that you're trying to answer. When you get to the discussion section, you've now answered that question. So if you start with your conclusions for the paper, it's going to be easier to make sure that the rest of the section is going to come back to that conclusion section to help keep things in focus and on track. Another really helpful thing in the discussion section is topic sentences. These are definitely your friend in this section. You start a paragraph by saying what that paragraph is about, and then you go into your details. And you're going to find that your topic sentences tend to reflect the rest of what's up on this list. So you might say something like, our findings are consistent with what's been shown previously. And then you might cite some studies and describe those. Or on the flip side of that, you might say, well, these findings represent a departure from what's been done previously, and here's why that might be. And then you'll have some discussion there. And all of these are things, again, that give some context to your findings. Other common topics that show up in the discussion section, potential limitations of your study. If you are writing a clinical paper, you cannot look at every single patient with this disease in the world and treat every single one of them with this drug. There's obviously going to be some kind of limitations. You're going to want to acknowledge that in your discussion section, and if you don't do it, your viewers are probably going to be looking for it. On the flip side of that, you also can emphasize the strengths of your study here. These are other good things to say. All of these are things that are a way to interpret your specific findings and make sure that your reviewers understand what your findings mean in a larger context. And ultimately what you do to wrap up your discussion section is state the implications of your findings. And that means, again, a takeaway message. What do we do with this information? How does this change the research field going forward? How does it improve our understanding of a disease or a topic or whatever it is we're looking at, or how does it potentially change clinical practice? So hopefully, maybe your reviewer doesn't necessarily agree with your implications, but you certainly want them to understand what you're trying to say. And if you've done that much, you've got a good start to this thing. So I've been talking so far about pieces of your paper, in particular sections that might cause trouble for reviewers. The rest of this is things that sort of apply to your entire paper. So no matter what type of paper you're writing, you really don't want a reviewer to do this. What a mess. This just belies frustration. And that can happen if you have a lot of details and those details are just everywhere. So maybe you have inconsistent terminology and inconsistent data. So in your results section, maybe you cite a couple of numbers and then point your reviewer to a table, but then they get to the table and it's a completely different list of numbers. Similarly, maybe you wrote an abstract for this research, then you did the research and you wrote your paper and a bunch of time has gone by, but you never went back to that abstract, and now that abstract doesn't really reflect what's in the paper. Other things that can happen, let's say you revise this paper a couple of times and you decided to take out a couple of figures or take out a couple of tables, but then didn't renumber the rest of the tables and figures. So a reviewer is going to be looking through this and thinking, okay, they're referring to figure 2, and then they look at figure 2 and think, what does that have to do with, that's not at all. Maybe they mean this other figure over here. And as soon as your reviewer is doing that, they're not paying attention to the content of your paper. Another thing can happen, incorrect citations. There's there's a lot of software out there nowadays that will help you avoid that. If you use EndNote, you're less likely to run into that kind of problem. But if you turned it off, you have numbered citations, and then the numbered citation refers to something else entirely. Again, these are sort of things that will really confuse a reviewer. So it can be confusing, and again, it's extra work because they're spending energy thinking, okay, what are they trying to say? Did they mean this? Did they mean that? And they're not sure. And all of these are things that detract from the main content of your paper, what you really want reviewers to focus on, which is your science. And just in general, again, this lack of attention to detail can also reflect a lack of attention to detail elsewhere in your paper. Oh, if they can't number their figures correctly, did they do their experiments right? You really don't want that idea going through your reviewer's mind at all. So, the obvious solution here, check your paper before you submit it. You want to cross-check your numbers. If you're, make sure that when you get to your results that you're referring to the right data, to the right tables, to the right figures. Make sure your citations are consistent. And also proofread your figures, especially if you have a lot of figures. In particular, the really detailed multi-part ones. You probably generated these in a software program, spit them out, and then didn't give it a second thought. By the time you get done revising your paper, maybe the labels on those figures aren't consistent with the way you referred to things in the text. Just those sort of things, things that can be easily overlooked. If you have a bunch of co-authors and everybody wanted to change something in the paper, you sent it to everybody, definitely use track changes so you can keep track of what got changed. And it's also sometimes a good idea if you have that situation to keep a master version of your paper so that you have one place where you've changed everything. And you might have one co-author say, oh, I don't like this wording here, but then they only changed it in one place. Before you submit the paper, you can go back and say, oh, okay, I agree with that. Let's make sure we change it in all the parts of the paper where this shows up. Let's make sure it's consistent so that we don't have reviewers, getting confused by this stuff. And obviously, another great way to avoid any kind of errors in your paper is to have a second set of eyes on it. Give it to a colleague, preferably maybe somebody who wasn't one of your co-authors, who hasn't been doing this research, because these type of errors are going to jump out really quickly at somebody who doesn't know right off what you're trying to describe or what ideas that you're trying to get across in this paper. So you can have a colleague look at it. Scientific publications, we are here to help you with these sort of problems as well. These are kind of errors that I tend to correct a lot in papers that I see. So I would much rather be doing that myself than have your reviewer seeing this stuff. That's definitely what we're here for. So, related to having a messy paper, you also don't want a reviewer to be doing this when they see your paper. What are they even talking about in this paper? Basically, here I'm talking about poor writing. So, spelling and grammar and punctuation type errors. One or two of these in a paper isn't really a big deal. If there's a lot of them, though, that's going to start becoming a problem. Not just those sort of details, though. It can also be unclear transitions. I mentioned topic sentences earlier. That's definitely helpful in the discussion section, but it's actually helpful throughout your paper. If a reviewer is reading through your paper and they get 2/3 of the way through a paragraph and go, what's this paragraph about? Or what does this have to do with what I was looking at before? Once again, you're creating extra work for them. Or word choice. If you've used imprecise, not even terminology, but words that go around the terminology. All of these are things that can confuse a reviewer. And more to the point, they can also annoy a reviewer. You really don't want somebody getting angry reading your paper. That's really not a good thing. But ultimately, the problems with poor writing are that it obscures the importance of your research. It makes it, less clear. It's distracting from the content of your paper. And that's, once again, really what this is all about. You want your content to be clear. So, the only way to avoid poor writing is to revise it. And I will say this, that everybody who writes makes terrible first drafts. Professional writers, their first drafts are awful too. That's okay. You're going to have to revise this thing a couple of times. Just expect it. It's part of the process. So go back through and reread it. You'll probably find that things that you wrote months ago, you'll go back to and say, oh, geez, why did I say that? That doesn't make any sense, and then completely rewrite it. That's a good thing to do. Once again, this is another great reason to have somebody else look at your paper. Doesn't have to be us. Can be a colleague. Again, a colleague who isn't a co-author, who hasn't been doing this research. These sort of problems will jump out very quickly. If English is not your first language and it's something that you struggle with, it's helpful to have a native speaker look at it. Those sort of errors will jump out very quickly at them in a way that they maybe won't jump out at you. And I know this from experience. Writing in another language is difficult. I've tried to do it and it didn't go well. So hats off to anybody who can pull that off. It's hard to do. So once again, having someone else look at your paper, and certainly, that's what Scientific Publications is here to do as well. We can definitely help you improve the quality of your writing. So those are kind of overall things. Other problems that can show up in a paper that you submit to a journal. Lack of diplomacy. This can get super awkward. Let's say you have in your discussion section, you're talking about how your work is different from what was done previously. Maybe you think that some of the previous work that you're citing was a little bit questionable. You don't think their conclusions made any sense. You have a sentence like, as usual, the Smith lab came up with an underpowered study with completely inappropriate patient selection criteria. But then Dr. Smith ends up being one of your reviewers. That's going to get really awkward. So you don't want to do that. You really don't want to personally attack anyone whose research that you're citing in your paper. You could accidentally, directly attack someone, obviously, but even if that's not who's reviewing your paper, it makes a bad first impression. Because once again, it's not what the point is. It's really not what you're trying to get across. You really want to emphasize why your study is useful, why your study should be a part of the literature and is important. So that's not the first impression that you want to leave. The key here is to make sure that when you describe others' work, just describe it like as if you're describing your own work. And that'll help you avoid a lot of these problems. Now, obviously, the example I gave was somewhat exaggerated. I don't know that I've ever seen one quite that egregious. But you also want to think about focusing on the findings and the methods and the interpretations of this other work that you're talking about, not on the author specifically. Another really helpful thing to avoid undiplomatic language is to focus on the strengths of your study rather than on the weaknesses of the others. So even if you leave the name off, you might say something like, okay, that study was underpowered and had a heterogeneous patient population. Maybe that's true, and it's not on the face of it necessarily wrong, but a slightly better way to word it would be to say, well, our study analyzed the largest patient population to date, and it was the first study to look at only patients who had advanced disease. So basically you're focusing in on something that you're doing in your paper that's a strength without it sounding like you're attacking whatever was done previously. You're not stating that. Presumably, whatever you're citing probably didn't have the same focus that you did. They maybe were trying to answer a different question. So it's not even necessarily appropriate to be critiquing others' work when you're describing it in a situation like this. So if you focus on what your work did well, why your work is, why your results are particularly rigorous or particularly valuable contribution to the literature, you can avoid this sort of problem. Okay, and speaking of awkward, another thing you really don't want a journal to think about your paper. Say, this looks awfully familiar. Haven't I read this before? You don't want the plagiarism, do not want the P word associated with your paper. That's really not something you want. Now we've probably all heard of of plagiarism. We probably all know, okay, don't do it. I mean, don't take someone else's work and pass it off as your own. That's fairly obvious. Where this gets a little bit more sticky is situations where it's inadvertent. Maybe you're describing methods that you've described previously, and you think, well, I'll just reuse the words. That can get you into trouble with copyright law, in particular if where you previously described your methods was in a journal that retained the copyright and you don't have it. That can get you into some trouble. Other things that might happen, maybe you're describing someone else's work, again, diplomatically, but you've used the same wording that was written previously in that paper when you go to write your paper. That's the kind of thing that can be caught if the journal is using plagiarism detection software, which is becoming increasingly common. A lot of journals run all papers through this software and it'll jump up, oh, this text was already published previously. So that's something you don't want to happen, ideally, to your paper. And beyond that, if it is something much more egregious than that, certainly there are some pretty serious consequences. The journal can immediately reject it. If it's truly an episode of plagiarism, they might ban you from submitting to the paper, to that journal again, you might run into academic misconduct violations, so it's certainly not a path you want to walk down. So to help you avoid those situations that are more inadvertent, you can, paraphrasing and summarizing are absolutely the best way to do that. If you are looking at, if you're describing previously published works and comparing it with your own, one way to help you avoid this is don't cut and paste it and think, oh, I'll just change a word here or there. That's the type of thing that the software will catch. So that's really not a good approach to take. You might also not want to have the original text sitting in front of you while you're writing your own. You're thinking, okay, I'm typing this in my own words. But if you have if you have whatever your source text is next to you, your brain is just naturally going to try and word it the same way, just because that's how they all work. So that's a way that might potentially get you into trouble. Usually the best approach there is to look at whatever it is that you want to describe or whatever it is that you want to interpret and have an idea in your mind, set aside the original, and then type it in your own words. You're a lot less likely to run into those sort of problems. You know, once again, even if your first draft isn't very good, that's okay. It's better that it's something you revise than something that, you know, looks like you accidentally stole it. You don't want that. You don't want anybody to have that idea in mind. You can also, you can go to the Research Medical Library here, and we have an institutional license to authenticate. So if you're really concerned, if you're thinking, oh, I don't know if I paraphrase this enough, oh, I don't know if these methods are too similar, you can always run it through the software and it will pop up for you if it's overlapping with previously published text. And the thing I particularly like about Authenticate as opposed to some of the other software programs available is you can delete your paper from it and it doesn't save it anywhere, it's just gone. The key here is it's meant to be a helpful tool for you that's not, you know, it's not like the plagiarism police. We want you to have this figured out and sorted out before you submit your journal, before you submit your paper to a journal. I don't want the journal to see it. It's much better that you fix it ahead of time and completely avoid the situation altogether. Yeah.
What's like the accepted maximum amount of plagiarism on average, 10%?
There's not really a standardized number. I think some journals will have like a 20%-ish cutoff, but really, if you're using that kind of software, it isn't so much the number that you're looking at as the content of what it appears to overlap. Some journals are going to be a lot more, you know, give you a lot more leeway if it's in the methods section than, say, the entire discussion section. That's generally a bigger problem. So you can't, it isn't entirely automated, like you have to actually look at it and make sense of it, you know, yourself to really know if it's a problem. So, okay. If you're looking for more information about plagiarism, Scientific Publications did a webinar on this topic not too long ago, and it's available on our intranet site. And so hopefully, and so if you're really concerned about this topic or wanting to know more information, we do have that available for you. So I don't really have time to go into a ton of detail about that here, just sort of some basic overview. So that's 10 things that you don't want journals to be saying about your paper when you first submit it to the paper. I have also one bonus item up here today. This is something you don't want to happen when you've gotten peer review and you go to resubmit your paper. You do not want a journal editor or a reviewer to say, well, okay, I gave you some comments, why did you just completely ignore them? This can happen when you don't address everything that a reviewer says when they review your paper, and then you go and resubmit it, and they're looking at basically the same paper or something that's very similar and didn't address their comments. Maybe you figured, well, okay, that comment was inappropriate, or they don't really understand this, so I'm just going to ignore it. Or, well, that's a minor thing. Oh, that's just a word choice. Oh, they're not going to notice. That's not a good approach to take when you do this, because it will look to a reviewer like you just ignored their advice completely. Even if you had a great reason for doing so, if you don't tell them what that great reason was, they're not ever going to know. So it can suggest, well, okay, good to know my advice was taken seriously, great. So you don't want to leave that impression. It can also just lead to your paper getting rejected because they said you submitted it for peer review, they gave you feedback, you didn't do their feedback, and they're like, well, we didn't like it the first time, so nothing's changed, so here we are. And also you could have another one of these awkward situations where maybe you don't even submit it to the same journal. You figure, well, okay, this journal doesn't like it, I'll try a different journal. It's entirely possible that the same peer reviewers might be reviewing for more than one journal. So then you could end up with this situation of, oh, well, okay, the same person is going to look at your paper and they're going to have the same concerns with it that they had the first time around. So that's not a good thing to be, not a good situation to be in. And just in general, reviewer comments, by and large, are meant to help you improve your science and improve the presentation of your science. So it represents a missed opportunity if you don't address them. Now that being said, of course, not all reviewer comments or criticisms are things you can address or should address, or should change from what they're saying. But what you want to make sure and do is acknowledge any criticism that you get from a peer reviewer. Now typically, if you're going to resubmit your paper to the same journal, you'll include with your resubmission a rebuttal letter. And that's an easy way to do that. You can list each comment and respond to each one individually. Obviously, it's important to be diplomatic when you do this. You want to thank them and say, okay, we appreciate this criticism. Okay, we did it. Or you might say, well, okay, I see why you thought that, but that doesn't apply in this situation because, and you might offer an explanation for it. And in most cases, that might be accepted. But what you'll probably find is that it's a good idea to go back to your original paper and alter something. You might think to yourself, okay, well, why did they think that? Maybe I can change or add a sentence somewhere in my introduction or in my discussion that explains why this particular criticism doesn't apply here and will prevent anyone else reading this paper from thinking the same thing. So it's always a good idea to explain why something wasn't done or why it was inappropriate or not belying belying a misunderstanding, I guess, of what you were trying to do. But that being said, you don't want anyone else to have the same misunderstanding. So keep this in mind when you're addressing reviewer comments. So that was 10 things and also a bonus. Beyond the question that we had already, did anybody have any questions? Yeah.
Normally when I submit, I know very well what the word limit is, and when I'm a few hundred over, I normally just submit anyway, and then if they kick it right back, then I edit it out. But normally they just let it go, but I wonder if that comes off as rude or if it annoys them.
Honestly, it depends on the journal. Some of them are super, super strict. Some of them do a word count check and think, oh, well, it's 3 words over, well, I'm just going to kick it back. Others of them don't even check it. You have absolutely no way to know that when you're looking at the author instructions unless you've submitted to this journal several times. I think it's generally good to be as close as you can. If it's really a couple hundred, if it's like 100 words or something, you might be able to shorten a sentence somewhere and get it even closer if you can. But I would suspect that unless it's egregiously over, you're probably not going to get, oh, they didn't pay attention. If they didn't kick it back to you, it's probably okay. So, yeah, it varies a lot. Any other questions? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Let's see. The one I'm familiar with, it's called Jane, I think Journal Author, I can't remember what it stands for, Journal Author Name Estimator or something like that. You can type in like the title of your manuscript and it'll pull up some journals that publish things with those topics. That's one. I think the Research Medical Library probably can point you to a couple of others. What did you guys have? You guys familiar with some of them too? PubSub. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, that's a good tool too because you can also look at, you can look at things like impact factor, but also topic and also time to publication. There's a lot of factors that go into it besides just, oh, it's a high impact or it's not. There's a lot of other things you might think about when you're picking a journal. Yeah.
We also have there's a webinar on the scientific publications website about it also talks about how to avoid literature.
Yeah, that's another good point.
A lot of open access journals are critical
Other questions? Yeah.
Speakers, for example, I use the Grammarly software. So,
Mm-hmm.
software, what do you think about software?
If you ask 12 editors about that question, half of them will say they love it and half of them will say they hate it, quite honestly. I've not used it personally. I have some colleagues who have and find it a useful tool. But I would say in general, any kind of software that's meant to correct grammar or even spell check and grammar check on Word, there's limitations to it. They haven't yet perfected AI that understands the English language, because frankly humans don't even understand the English language all that well. It's a tricky language. So it's a good place to start. If you find it helpful and it's not terribly buggy on your computer or something, it's worth doing, but you always want to go back and check. Sometimes the AI will not quite interpret the language right, so you want to go back and make sure that it's done properly. But I don't, I'm not going to say, oh, don't ever use it. Usually these things will help you get a good start, but I don't think that's what you want to rely on entirely. Yeah. Yep, good.
Before submit the paper, our paper can be checked by the native speaker you suggested. That checking part should be familiar with the article topic or not.
Familiar with, I'm sorry.
Before we submit the paper,
Mm-hmm.
the native speaker can be checked the word or grammar.
Right.
That checking person should be familiar with the topic with our article.
Oh,
Not important.
so you're,
If any person.
so you're asking, should you have somebody look at it who's familiar with the topic and the information that you're publishing? I mean, not necessarily. I will tell you that, within scientific publications, many of us, most of us actually, are not necessarily, scientists or don't even have a background with it. What you're really looking for is somebody to understand what you're trying to say in the paper. The reviewers are going to be checking your science. That's, a given. You're going to have that kind of feedback. What you're really looking for here is to make sure that your paper's understandable, just the writing itself is understandable, so they can even, understand enough to know what you're trying to say underneath there. So I would say they don't necessarily have to be. Ideally, you want somebody who's going to be honest with you. They'll look at it and say, hey, it looks great. That's not going to be helpful. You do want somebody that's going to give you honest feedback and who's likely to be able to give you, say, oh, okay, here's how you can fix this, or here's how a better way to say this. I think you'll get the most out of it that way. Was there another question over here?
So often editors will select reviewers that have a significant amount of experience in that area.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a specific verbiage you could use to exclude reviewers who might be direct competitors that might not have your best interests in mind when they're reviewing this paper?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's okay to state up front, this potential, I would recommend please don't send it to this reviewer because they have a conflict of interest. You can state it that way. Someone who's a direct competitor certainly would have, would not be able to give you an unbiased review. So I would kind of, frame it that way. Potential conflict of interest, potential, unable to give a biased comment. You're not saying, oh, this person's terrible or they're bad. It's no. There's actually a good reason here, and make sure you emphasize that and not, just don't make it too personal. I guess if that makes sense. I don't know that there's a specific way to word that, but I think, yeah, phrases conflict of interest, unable to do unbiased. Those are probably good phrases that might, help you out with that. Does that answer your question? Okay. Any other questions? Yeah. Yes, the Research Medical Library has access to it. That's the first place you can go. They can help you get set up. You can set up an account there. You can also, if you submit something through our department, we can run it through Authenticate as well and tell you if there's a particular problem to come up. If you'd rather do it yourself, though, you can go directly to the library, and they can help you set that up. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I mentioned earlier, if you are looking for assistance writing your paper, you can contact Scientific Publications, and this is our contact information, the phone number to our main office, and also our email address. And we do, as I've mentioned, have a page on the intranet that has several webinars and a bunch of other information that might be helpful for you as you're writing your article. And you are always welcome to contact us if you have specific questions. Whether you have a paper that's ready to edit or not, we can also help you just with general writing questions. So, are there any other questions, though, today? Okay. Thank you all for coming this afternoon, and have a great afternoon.